I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
I have some concerning information regarding England's royal family. The chapel had been silent only seconds earlier, yet one entrance shattered that calm. Catherine was already seated when Meghan stepped inside and started walking toward the same royal pew. Then came the moment nobody anticipated. Catherine rose without offering any greeting, turned away from the service, and proceeded directly toward the chapel doors. There was no argument, no explanation, just one devastating gesture that instantly converted a private royal gathering into a family crisis. Before we explore further what this truly signified for the royal family, please subscribe so you do not miss any future updates. Catherine did not pause once she stood up. The private service at St. George's Chapel, the historic church located within Windsor Castle where royal ceremonies and family services frequently take place, had brought senior members of the family together after months of strained contact between the Sussexes and the working royals. That tension was significant because everyone who entered the chapel understood that even the smallest action could be interpreted as either a sign of peace or a sign of rejection. Yet when Meghan approached the pew reserved for Catherine's immediate family, the princess made a decision instantly. She would depart rather than sit beside her. William observed the movement with increasing disbelief. His wife reached the end of the pew, placed one hand against the wooden rail, and glanced toward him for barely a second. He understood immediately that this was not confusion about seating arrangements. She had reached a boundary she was no longer willing to cross. The prince remained caught between sitting down and stepping back. Harry noticed the hesitation, but she remained standing long enough for the silence around them to become impossible to ignore. What had looked like a simple return to a family pew now carried the unmistakable weight of rejection. Charles felt the atmosphere change before anyone spoke. A senior aide quietly moved after Catherine, making it clear that palace staff understood this was more serious than an awkward seating mistake. The king turned toward William, and the look between them lasted only a moment. Yet it carried something not a man needed to explain. An earlier private dispute had finally broken through a controlled surface of royal ceremony. That was what made the walkout dangerous. Catherine had not simply left Meghan behind. She had reacted to something already unresolved. And to understand why one step toward the pew triggered such a powerful response, the story had to move away from the chapel doors and into the deeply personal history of the four people trapped inside. This was never really about where someone sat today. Beneath the polished ceremony stood years of bruised trust, unfinished conversations, competing loyalties, and memories neither side had forgotten. Catherine's departure exposed something the palace had spent years trying to contain. The relationship between William, Catherine, Harry, and Meghan had stopped being merely difficult. It had become personal enough that even a wooden church pew could feel like a boundary nobody was permitted to cross. William knew immediately how serious the walkout was because Catherine had spent years doing the opposite. She had learned to keep private discomfort away from ceremonial royal spaces where every movement could take on meaning far beyond the moment itself. A royal service was meant to protect dignity, not expose family wounds. That was why her decision carried such weight. She had not lost control. She had decided that staying would force her to perform a closeness she no longer felt. Catherine reached the quiet corridor beyond the chapel and kept moving until William caught up with her. He said her name softly, but she did not turn at once. When she finally faced him, sadness had replaced the sharpness of the moment inside. She told him she could not remain there and asked him not to make her go back. The prince understood the request immediately. His wife was not trying to punish anyone. She was trying to protect a boundary she believed had already been crossed. Harry saw the same moment very differently. He watched Meghan standing alone after Catherine left and felt his instinct to defend her rise almost instantly. Their return to the family gathering had been meant as a temporary attempt at peace, not a restoration of the royal position they had once held. That distinction mattered because everyone had arrived with different expectations. He saw rejection. William saw another misunderstanding beginning before the first one had even been explained. Meghan remained composed, but the silence around her became harder to ignore. She had entered believing proximity might signal that the family could occupy the same space without another confrontation. Instead, she had become the center of one. Harry moved closer to her while she quietly asked whether Catherine had left because of her. He did not answer immediately, and that hesitation told her more than reassurance ever could. Charles had encouraged both couples to attend because he believed physical closeness might soften years of distance. The king had hoped one controlled family gathering could create a small opening. Instead, He had placed 4 wounded people inside the same emotional fault line. William already knew something his father did not. Before arriving, Catherine had warned him there was one boundary Meghan could not cross. She never explained it publicly, but she had made the line unmistakably clear to him, and that line had not been drawn inside the chapel. It had been drawn weeks earlier behind a closed door. When Catherine and Meghan were finally left alone, weeks before Windsor, there had been another room, another silence, and one conversation both women would remember differently. There were no cameras, no crowds, and no ceremonial distractions. Only Catherine and Meghan sitting opposite one another after a family reception, trying to discuss what reconciliation would actually require. It began calmly. It ended with Catherine standing beside the door and drawing a boundary so precise that the later chapel walkout suddenly becomes impossible to misunderstand. Catherine had agreed to the private conversation because she wanted to stop the tension before another family gathering turned uncomfortable. The reception at Windsor Castle had been arranged partly to ease relations before future appearances, and that mattered because even a small public sign of strain could quickly become a much larger royal story. Meghan understood the pressure, too. She had returned hoping for a quieter relationship with the family, but she already felt that every attempt to step closer was being treated as another intrusion. Meghan spoke first. She told Catherine that she was tired of feeling as though every gesture was being judged before it was even made. She said she could walk into a room with good intentions and still be treated as though she had crossed a line. Catherine listened, but her response was controlled and painful. She said reconciliation could not grow while private family moments kept becoming part of wider conversations. For her, trust had to come before appearances. The tension sharpened when Meghan told her she felt the emotional door had been closed long ago. Catherine did not raise her voice. She simply answered that trust could not be demanded simply because 2 people happened to share the same room. Meghan heard rejection in those words. Catherine believed she was stating something necessary. Neither woman moved, and the distance between them suddenly felt greater than when the conversation began. Then Meghan said what changed everything. At the next family service, she intended to sit beside Harry, William, and Catherine so the public could see that the family was together again. Catherine's expression changed immediately. She told her that such a gesture would suggest a reconciliation that had not actually happened. More importantly, she asked her directly not to do it. The request was calm, but there was nothing vague about it. Catherine rose when the conversation ended and opened the door before Meghan stepped out. She said quietly, "Please don't make a public gesture out of something we haven't repaired privately." Meghan paused, but she did not answer. She left believing a peace offering had been refused. Catherine remained behind, believing a clear boundary had finally been understood. That difference changed everything. So when Meghan later walked toward the same pew at Windsor, Catherine did not see an innocent seating choice. She saw the exact warning from that private conversation being ignored in public. And once that happened, walking away was no longer the end of the conflict. It was the beginning of the confrontation both women had been avoiding. The chapel doors closed behind Catherine, but the conflict did not stay inside them for long. Within minutes, Meghan followed, and what had begun as a silent withdrawal became the confrontation everyone had feared. There were no court between them now, no service to hide behind, and no carefully prepared statement waiting to rescue the moment. Catherine had walked away to avoid a scene. Meghan followed because walking away had become the scene. Catherine stood in the adjoining private chamber trying to steady herself, while William remained inside long enough to stop the service from descending into complete confusion. That choice mattered because the prince understood that following immediately could make the rupture look even larger. Meghan stayed inside only briefly before turning to Harry and telling him she needed to speak directly to Catherine. She believed another silent retreat would allow resentment to harden before either woman had a chance to explain herself. Meghan entered and stopped near the door. She asked why Catherine had humiliated her in front of the family. Catherine placed both hands firmly against the back of the chair but refused to sit. She answered that humiliation had never been the intention. She had left because the boundary discussed weeks earlier had been ignored, and remaining in that pew would have made her participate in a public message she had already said she was not ready to send. Meghan pushed back immediately. She said the seating was meant as peace, not pressure, and that she had believed sitting together would show that the family could move forward. Catherine told her that public symbolism without private trust did not feel like reconciliation. It felt like being forced to pretend. Each time either woman used the word trust, the conversation grew sharper because both believed they were the one being asked to surrender first. Then Meghan said something Catherine had not expected. She explained that Charles had encouraged the idea of the two couples appearing visibly reunited during the service. The king's intention, as he understood it, had been simple, show that the family could stand together despite everything that had happened. Meghan had taken that message literally. Catherine had never heard it that way. Catherine's anger did not disappear, but something inside the argument shifted. For the first time, she considered that Meghan might not have entered the pew simply to challenge her warning. If different expectations had been given to different people, then the disaster had been building long before either woman reached the chapel. That realization changed the target of the questions. Meghan was still hurt. Catherine was still furious, but neither could ignore the possibility that the misunderstanding had been created above them. And if Charles had encouraged a very simple Catherine had explicitly rejected, then the next confrontation would not remain between two women. It would lead directly to the king. Charles had wanted one morning of unity. Instead, his attempt to bring the family physically closer had exposed just how emotionally far apart they remained. By the time he learned what had happened outside the chapel, the problem was no longer a question of etiquette. Two women believed they had been placed in an impossible situation. Two brothers were preparing to defend their wives, and the king now had to confront an uncomfortable truth. His plan for reconciliation had moved faster than reconciliation itself. Charles had imagined something simple. Bring both sides into the same family occasion, soften the formal distance for one morning, and let proximity suggest warmth without forcing anyone into a public statement. That mattered because royal seating can carry symbolic meaning far beyond the place itself, especially when relationships are already strained. A seat beside someone can look like acceptance. A gap can look like rejection. The king had hoped the family could survive that symbolism. Instead, it had detonated underneath them. William spoke first when the two men were finally alone. He told his father that Catherine had already warned against any stage sign of reconciliation, and had been clear that public closeness could not come before private trust. Charles listened without interrupting. Then he removed his glasses, placed them beside the folded order of service, and stayed silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. He said he should have been clearer. Harry pushed back almost immediately. He argued that Meghan had understood the invitation differently and should not be blamed for following what she believed was the spirit of the morning. She had not entered the pew to provoke anyone, he insisted. She had believed the family was being encouraged to appear together. William answered with equal force. Catherine's presence, he said, could not be turned into proof of forgiveness simply because everyone wanted a peaceful image. Charles felt the weight of both arguments because each contained part of the truth. He admitted that he had told Harry he hoped the two couples would appear together during the service. But the monarch had never specifically instructed Meghan to sit beside Catherine. That single distinction changed everything. One vague message had been interpreted as permission. One private warning had been understood as a firm boundary, and both collided in the same pew. The truth was suddenly harder than blame. There was no single villain. Charles had encouraged symbolic unity. Meghan had acted on that expectation, and Catherine had protected a boundary she believed had already been ignored. The king now faced a choice he could no longer avoid. He could force everyone back together and risk another humiliation, or accept that the family was still divided and let their movement show it. But Charles's regret could not undo what Windsor had already witnessed. Within minutes, the consequences began moving beyond the chapel walls. There was no dramatic announcement after the confrontation. The damage appeared in smaller movements, one brother turning left while the other remained behind, aid suddenly rearranging departures, conversation stopping whenever a door opened. The family had entered Windsor hoping to demonstrate calm. They were now divided into separate rooms, each side convinced it had been placed in an unfair position. Catherine's walkout had lasted less than a minute. Its consequences immediately began reshaping the entire day. Palace staff moved quickly once it became clear that forcing another shared appearance would only deepen the strain. The post-service schedule was quietly changed so Catherine and Meghan would not be required to stand beside one another again that morning. That mattered because every public movement now carried emotional meaning. William stayed close to his wife while Harry remained with Meghan. Without anyone intending it, the family had recreated the exact division the gathering had been designed to soften. Catherine felt the cost almost immediately. She did not regret leaving the pew, but she hated knowing William had once again been pulled between two loyalties he could not separate. As heir, he was expected to protect stability. As a husband, he could see exactly why she had reached her limit. When he stepped away to speak with Charles, she sat alone for several minutes, holding the untouched order of service she had carried out with her. Eventually, she folded it close and placed it beside her without saying a word. Meghan carried a different kind of pain into the other room. She told Harry that the moment seemed confirmed something she had feared for years. Every attempt to re-enter certain family spaces would be judged for hidden motives. He felt anger rise again, but beneath it was exhaustion. He had watched the same emotional pattern repeat too many times. Meghan wanted him to understand that she had not entered the pew looking for confrontation. He did, but even he could no longer pretend intention was the only thing that mattered. William returned with information that unsettled Catherine. Charles had accepted responsibility for creating an unclear expectation around the seating. The king had admitted his words about appearing together could easily have been interpreted differently. That confession complicated everything. The prince had initially believed Meghan ignored the boundary on purpose. Now certainty was beginning to crack. Catherine then heard something else. Meghan had left their confrontation shaken, not satisfied. She had not treated the walkout like a victory. That detail stayed with her because it challenged the simplest explanation she had given herself, that the pew had been chosen as an act of defiance. William finally sat beside Catherine and told her there was only one way to stop the moment from becoming permanent. She and Meghan had to speak again. No husbands, no aides, no ceremony, no symbols. The palace could rearrange schedules and separate rooms. It could not repair trust. That would require two women sitting down with nothing left to hide behind. By late afternoon, the anger had cooled enough for something more dangerous to emerge: honesty. Catherine and Meghan agreed to meet again. This time without William, without Harry, and without a royal event forcing them to perform unity for anyone else. The atmosphere was no longer explosive. It was exhausted. Both women understood that another argument now was whether either could admit that the Windsor incident had been shaped as much by fear as by intention. Catherine entered the small sitting room first and chose a chair away from the formal areas they had occupied earlier. Meghan arrived moments later and closed the door behind her. Neither woman tried to solve years of conflict in a single conversation. They agreed to talk only about the warning before the service, the decision at the pew, and what each had believed the other was trying to do. That narrow focus mattered because their earlier arguments had collapsed under the weight of everything that came before. Catherine spoke first. She admitted that walking out had been an act of self-protection as much as anger. Staying beside Meghan would have created an image she was not emotionally ready to endorse. And she feared that one photograph or one description of them sitting together would be treated as proof that everything had been forgiven. She was not prepared to let ceremony speak for feelings she did not yet have. Meghan answered with equal restraint. She said entering the pew had come from almost the opposite fear. Refusing the implied gesture of unity, she believed, could have been interpreted as hostility toward the family. She felt trapped between appearing distant if she stayed away and intrusive if she moved closer. For the first time, Catherine heard the decision not as a challenge, but as another attempt to avoid public judgment. The contradiction landed heavily between them. Both women had acted because they feared being misrepresented. Yet Catherine's attempt to avoid false reconciliation made Meghan feel publicly rejected, while Meghan's attempt to avoid looking hostile made Catherine feel publicly pressured. Neither had achieved what she intended. Both had created exactly the misunderstanding she had been trying to escape. Catherine remained silent for several seconds, then moved from the chair opposite Meghan and sat closer. The gesture was not warm, but it was deliberate. She told her they had to stop allowing ceremony to speak for them. Private trust, she said, had to come before public symbolism. Meghan accepted that principle. She did not pretend everything was suddenly healed, and Catherine did not ask her to. Their agreement was smaller than friendship, but more important than another performance. Neither side would use the Windsor incident as a weapon against the other. Yet their private ceasefire came too late to contain the image itself. Outside Windsor, Catherine's walkout was already becoming something far larger than either woman intended. By evening, one image had swallowed every explanation, Catherine leaving Windsor while Meghan remained behind. To the public, there was no private conversation, no confused instruction from Charles, no distinction between symbolic reconciliation and genuine trust. There was only a departure, And as broadcasters, newspapers, commentators, and royal watchers turned seconds of movement into a national conversation, the family discovered how quickly a deeply personal boundary could become a public verdict. Palace aides chose silence over a detailed explanation. They knew that describing the argument would expose private conversations and transform a family wound into an official royal dispute. That mattered because once the palace confirmed specific details, every sentence could become another weapon. William and Harry separately agreed not to brief against one another, meaning neither side would quietly feed damaging claims to the media. The restraint was fragile. But for the first time that day, both brothers were trying to stop the conflict from growing. Catherine watched the public discussion with a tightening sense of regret. She feared that leaving the pew would now be interpreted as cruelty rather than self-protection, and the difference mattered deeply to her.